Factor each of the following completely. Alright, so we're going to factor completely. There's all kinds of different factoring methods, so we've got to be able to look at a problem and figure out which method to use. So for this first one, I notice that there are 4 terms. Anytime I see 4 terms, I'm going to use grouping. Be able to recognize that. 4 terms grouping. So I'm going to group the first 2, group the last 2, and then when you're grouping, you go to each group and you look for the greatest common factor. So I have an 8 and a 10. So what would divide into 8 and 10? The largest number would be 2. And then they each have an n term. So I'm going to take out the n. So I'm going to divide each term by 2n. And I will be left with 4m minus 5. Then you go to the next group and you look for the greatest common factor here. So I've got a 12 and a 15. So what's the largest number that would go into 12 and 15? Well, that would be a 3, a positive 3. So I'm going to take out a positive 3. So I'm going to divide each term by 3. And when I do that, that gives me 4m minus 5. Now, when you're factoring by grouping, you'll know you're doing this correctly if you have the same value in parentheses, which I have 4m minus 5 in parentheses, so I know I'm on the right track. If you don't have the same value, then you're not doing something correctly. You need to go back and think it through again and see what you're doing wrong. So once I have the same value in parentheses, I'm going to group the outside numbers, 2x or 2n plus 3, and that is one of my factors. And then whatever's in parentheses will become the other factor. And that's your final answer. We factored it completely. If I FOIL 2n plus 3 and 4n minus 5 together, I should end up with 8mn minus 10n plus 12n minus 15. All right, number 26. Now, if you look at this problem originally, you have 2 terms and you have subtraction. So the factoring methods that we use for 2 terms would be difference of cubes and difference of squares. If you look at the c value, it's squared, so you should be thinking in your mind difference of squares. So hopefully you know what the difference of squares formula is. And that just says if you have a squared minus b squared, then it factors to a plus b and a minus b. Now, before I apply the difference of squares, though, I'm going to look and see, is there a greatest common factor that I can factor out of 125? Is there a number that goes into both of those? Well, 25 divides into 100 and it divides into 25. So I'm going to take out the greatest common factor first, and that is a 25. So let's see what I'm left with after I divide everything by 25. That would leave me with 4c squared minus 1. And then if I look at this, I still have a difference of squares. Because what can I square that will give me 4c squared? Well, that would be 2c. And then can I square something and get a 1? Well, that would be 1 squared is 1. Alright, so I still have a difference of 2 squares. This 2c is my a value and the 1 is my b. So I'm just going to factor it as a plus b, a minus b, which would be 2c plus 1 and 2c minus 1. But don't forget your greatest common factor that you took out at the beginning needs to be brought down. So your final answer is 25 times 2c plus 1 times 2c minus 1. All right, if we go to number 27 here, we've got 2 terms, and we're going to start out, we're going to look for the greatest common factor. So what can go into 8 and 12? Well, that would be a 4. And then they each have at least 3 a's, so I can take out an a cubed as well. So I'm going to divide each term by 4a cubed. And then that leaves me with 2 minus, and then 12 divided by 4 is 3. A to the 4th divided by a to the 3rd is a, and then b squared. And then after I take out the greatest common factor, I always want to see what's left in parentheses to see if that can be factored. 2 minus 3ab squared, it can't be factored. There's no pattern for that, so this would be my final answer. Question number 28 is a factoring, and this one's got three terms. It's a trinomial. The a value is a 1, so a equals 1. So we've got to figure out what can you multiply when you have a equals 1, two numbers that multiply to give us our c, but when we add them together we get the b value. So c is 64 and b is negative 20. So we've got to go through and think about what are the factors here. So I got to think of everything that multiplies to give me 64. I'm just going to go over here and write. I got 8 times 8 is 64. I've got 1 times 64. I've got 2 times 32. I've got, see, 3 doesn't go into it. 4 times 16. Alright, so if I look at that, 4 plus 16 does give me 20, but I need it to be negative. So if you think about it, a negative 4 times a negative 16 gives you negative 20. Or when you multiply it, you get positive 64, and then a negative plus a negative. So those two numbers will work. Negative 4, negative 16. So it factors to y minus 4 and y minus 16. And remember, if you don't know all the numbers that multiply to give you 64, go over here and write them down. That's what I had to do. I couldn't look at it and think of what would give me negative 20 at the first, but if I go and write them down, then you can see the pattern. And if you look at these two factors, they cannot be broken down any further, so that's your final answer.